Hey, so another boxing video here. Um, I want to talk about the subject of fighters fighting past their prime, both in terms of the health aspect and also the influence of that on the sport and on boxing fan views of the sport. One of the most famous examples of this is Muhammad Ali fighting into the early 1980s, and there were two fights in particular that really demonstrated that he'd went well past where he should have gone, and that was the Holmes fight and the Berbick fight. Now, in the case of Larry Holmes, Holmes himself is acknowledged as one of the greatest heavyweights ever. People often say suffered from the fact he had to follow Ali onto the stage, and I guess that's some truth in that. But most people would rank Holmes amongst top 10, 20 heavyweights ever. Berbick certainly not. But I've just been watching the video of that Berbick fight, and it's the last fight that Ali was in. Don't know where the announcers got the idea that it was a great fight. That's certainly questionable. Um, but what was noticeable was the hate leveled against Berbick on that thread from a lot of Ali fans. And it sort of went along these lines that Berbick was a bitch for fighting an older man who was really not in a great condition. So the contention is that Berbick was sort of taking an easy fight. Like that's kind of where the criticism is leveled against him. They're even saying things like they're pleased Tyson beat him later on as revenge. Um, I'm sure Mike Tyson didn't beat Berbick as revenge. I'm sure Mike Tyson beat Berbick because Mike Tyson wanted to beat Berbick. Um, Trevor Berbick, in fact, has the distinction of being the only man to have faced both Ali and Tyson. Now, he lost both fights, but I think you have to acknowledge that's something that stands him out. Um, I think this disrespect leveled against Berbick is unfortunate, partly because he's deceased, and from what I recall, he was murdered. So it's a bit crude to be talking about a man who suffered homicide in such a tasteless way. Um, Clearly, those fights shouldn't have happened. Clearly, Ali should not have been fighting either Holmes or um, Berbick. Ali probably should have retired in the mid to late 70s. He probably should have retired, in all honesty, sometime after the thriller in Manila, but as we know, he went on. Now, this is the thing. Muhammad Ali was a grown man, and he made the decision to continue fighting. Sure, you can talk about Don King, you can talk about Angelo Dundee, you could talk about a lot of other people, but in the end of the day, Muhammad Ali was a grown man and he chose to keep fighting. Um, Now, a compassionate camp would have talked him out of it, and they're certainly partly to blame for that. And I do think it's, I'm not a doctor, but I think it's pretty obvious that the current condition Ali faces can at least partly be blamed on the excess punishment he took in those fights, which was completely unnecessary. Certainly in the closing rounds, he had a lot of power shots that were unanswered from both Holmes and Berbick, and I suspect in other fights as well. Um, so I think when it comes to fighters fighting past their prime, um, obviously the fighters are partly responsible because they are adults and they do make the choice to do this themselves. Obviously, there's pressure in the world of boxing, but there isn't actually a forced situation or someone holding a gun to their head and saying you have to fight. In terms of contracts, there is legal issues there in terms of continuing to fight, but they have to pass medical checks as well. That's another issue that needs to be considered. Clearly, there are occasions when fighters have to be saved from themselves, and that comes down to a compassionate, a referee in the fight, but the referee only sees the fighter really on fight night. It comes down to trainers of fighters to really help to step in there. That may mean ending a professional partnership, but if they're decent people, they would do that. I mean, if I was a trainer and I thought my fighter had been through enough, I would be doing my level best to talk him out of it. And I would say, okay, if you're going to continue fighting, a bit like Mickey in the Rocky series, you do it without me because I don't want to have that on my conscience. Um, so when people are blaming everyone else, Ali chose to keep fighting himself, and in one sense that's admirable because it shows a warrior spirit. On the other hand, it was reckless. There's no escaping the fact that it was reckless. There's no question about it. Muhammad Ali was an incredibly brave man, but fighting as late as he did was reckless. Um, but the hate leveled against Berbick is ridiculous. I mean, and I guess this ties into the video I made earlier about the sort of personality cult. People tend to hate guys who beat popular great fighters. And on a smaller scale, the same thing happened here when Henry Cooper was beaten by Joe Bugner. I remember Bugner was booed. He was a young guy, he was only in his early 20s. He beat the great Henry Cooper. The British public vilified him. And that was really unfortunate. He'd done nothing wrong. All he'd done was done what he had to do as a boxer and won the fight. And it was ridiculous the way the British public treated him. And I see something similar here to, you know, the way Berbick was treated. Now, I'm sure Berbick himself would have been the first to admit that Ali was past his prime. But in the end of the day, it was a boxing match, and a win is a win. So I take issue with people sort of disassociating responsibility from fighters because fighters do have responsibility. I also take issue with attacking a fighter for fighting simply because he beats, you know, attacking the guys who beat the guys is ridiculous. Um, it's if you get a great fighter who's beaten by a guy who's not great, what I mean by that is doesn't demonstrate that later on. Um, Taking that away from the guy, it doesn't. He's not a bitch. That's ridiculous. Okay, he's not. Had he fought a younger Ali, of course he'd be beaten. There's no question about it. If he'd fought the Ali of the mid 60s, of course he'd be beaten. That isn't the point. The point is in a boxing match, one man wins, one man loses. And Ali lost that fight. There's no escaping that fact. It wasn't that there was biased judges or anything. He lost the fight. So, and that's just one example. There's many others. I find that people are always wanting to make excuses for great fighters. There are people to this day insist that Mike Tyson wasn't beaten by Buster Douglas, which is ridiculous. Um, so I think that in the world of boxing, people need to just accept a win as a win. I understand that there is corruption and there are times where there are deeply controversial decisions, like Bradley Pacquiao. But again, people leveled vitriol at Tim Bradley. Fighters themselves, their job is to fight. So if a guy wins a fight and it's down to what the judges have decided or the referee has decided, don't blame the fighter for that, because all he has done is what he had to do. I mean, did people expect Trevor Berbick to try and lose because he didn't want to beat Ali? Come on. Um, would they have expected Bradley to? I mean, people were saying things that Bradley should have handed over his win to Pacquiao and stuff. Now, I'm a Pacquiao fan, but that's just ridiculous. What sort of fighter would Tim Bradley be if he was declared a winner of a fight and he said, "No, I lost"? That's that would be ridiculous. It would be completely contrary to any fighter's mentality. And if the situation was reversed, I don't think Pacquiao would do that. So what I'm saying is, when a fighter wins a fight, give him credit because a win is a win. Unless it's a blatant case of corruption, i.e., he's paid the judges or something, that's different. But I think largely boxing has cleaned up a bit since the 60s when the mob ruled the sport. I do honestly think that it's better than them than that time. Um, that's all I'm saying. In terms of fighters going past their prime, there are some guys who are sensible and who retire when they need to retire. Rocky Marciano and Joe Calzaghe. Those guys knew that they had hit as high as they were going to get, and they retired as relatively young men who then went on to have successful lives. Max Schmeling is another example. And that's really admirable. And that's not taking anything away from the courage of those guys who continue, but it is reckless. Another example is Audley Harrison. He has fought. I think he still fights, in fact, and everyone would agree he needs to stop. I like Audley Harrison actually overall, but again, if I could meet Audley Harrison, I would say, look, I have a lot of respect for you, but please retire. It's troubling to see a man punish himself when he doesn't need to. Um, I think one reason for this is that a lot of boxers, bearing in mind that a lot of young men get into the sport as a way to get away from the streets, in many cases they don't know anything else. Now, in some cases, you get guys who do find they've got talent in other areas. I mean, Carl Froch is looking into real estate. Max Schmeling ended up as president of Coca-Cola. There's other examples. Manny Pacquiao's multi-talented. But there are some guys who don't know anything else, and that's why they continue to fight. It's not necessarily a case that they like to be hit. It's that they don't know anything else. And I think the world of boxing needs to offer those guys support when they retire. That's something the sport lacks. There is no post-fight support really. There's benefit balls and so on, but there isn't really any support given. It's a bit like a soldier who's been to a war zone suffering post-traumatic stress, and there's been accusations of soldiers not getting sufficient treatment. Um, I'm not saying it's the same thing, but maybe there needs to be a lot more respect and care given to fighters when they retire. And I'm not sure if there is. There's been too many examples of guys having breakdowns. Frank Bruno in Britain is one tragic example. Now, I'm not saying that the world of boxing can do everything and wrap them in cotton wool, but I think more can be done. Um, this is an incredibly psychological sport. That's an aspect that can't be underestimated, just as much as it is physical. So, few closing thoughts. I think that when fighters are fighting past their prime, people around them need to protect them. They need to not only try to encourage them not to continue, but help them to find a life outside the sport. Even if that means a non-combat role in sport, commentating, for instance, anything, but they need to be protected from themselves. Um, and it is sad to watch a fighter fight past his prime, but I think it's ridiculous blaming his opponent for that. I mean, the way boxing politics works is times guys have little choice. They have to fight the mandatory. It may well be that the X grade is the mandatory. So there's all of these things to consider. Let me know your thoughts.